So anyway, I started blasting. Hello everybody, it is me, Sci-Fi, and today I'm back with another weapon review. And today we're going to be looking at a personal favorite of mine from before the new Jade Shadows update with the health and armor changes, but has become infinitely better now because of some of the new damage types that we have gotten, and that is the Battacor. So the Battacor is a Mastery Rank 10 auto burst rifle that can be built in the Energy Lab in the Nintendo Dojo. It requires materials that are from the Orb Valis, which is the open world of Venus, and is generally a bit of an annoyance to farm, so depending on whether or not you have certain discounts or have the materials to build it, you could either buy it with platinum, which is surprisingly cheaper than other weapons in the market, or you could farm for the materials to build it. Now, the Battacor supports a relatively low fire rate in comparison to other rifles, at least in comparison to auto rifles, that is. But seeing that it's a burst weapon, it's not too bad, especially because, unlike other burst weapons, you can still hold down the trigger and it will trigger the next burst automatically for you, rather than having to click the trigger again. Meaning that the new semi-auto rifle mods that we got in the Jade Shadows update won't work on this thing. In fact, it won't even show up on screen. Even if they did work, you wouldn't really want to because the fire rate is pretty low, and this thing loves fire rate. Another great thing about the Battacor is that it has a high magazine capacity in comparison to other rifles and burst rifles. It's not the highest, obviously. The highest that I have seen so far are weapons like the Soma and Trumda, where they both have 200 ammo in their magazines at base. But in comparison to the rifles, it's solid, especially for a burst rifle that also has an automatic trigger. It also has a high ammo reserve, making it pretty easy to get ammo for this thing and to upkeep your ammo too. And lastly, it also supports a pretty decent reload speed. It's not the fastest, but with a good amount of modding, you can make it so that you can reload this thing pretty fast if you're in the middle of combat. Now, much like the Trumna, the Battacor supports an alt-fire mechanic that involves having to get kills in order to recharge it. Now, it's not perfect in comparison to the Trumna. For starters, you need 3 kills to charge up the Battacors instead of the 5 of the Trumna, but you don't have to get all 3 kills in order to use the alt-fire. It's just that getting all 3 kills will give you the maximum damage of the alt-fire. In addition, the alt-fire of the Battacor is an AoE blast, similar to an Opticore blast, actually. But the difference is that it has pretty decent fall off in comparison to other weapons, and it doesn't do the best damage type. Radiation after the new update has kind of been seen as the worst of the damage types because there's so many enemies that you would want to use it on that are pretty negative towards it. But this can all be fixed with its augment, Sentient Barrage. And what Sentient Barrage does is that it removes the AoE of the Opticore alt-fire, but gives the beam infinite punch through and allows it to recharge when you get hit with the alt-fire. Meaning that you can keep the alt-fire pretty easily with it, but even with it, you can't really build any specific damage type into it, like electricity or blast generally. It's mostly damage types like slash that, because the alt-fire can crit really easily, that is the best to use with it. So something like 100 munitions is going to be the best thing to use if you want to use the alt-fire. But otherwise, we're kind of going to be staying away from the alt-fire for this video because the primary fire is where most of the gameplay and good parts of this weapon are at. Now on the primary fire, it supports a pretty high crit chance of 32%, which with just one critical delay mod can give you 96% crit chance, which generally means that you're going to be hitting yellow crits all the time. And when combined with any of the vigilante mods, it means you also have the chance of getting orange crits. It's not very high, but it's there. And building it as a crit weapon is even more incentivized because it has a pretty high crit multiplier of 2.4x. Now that is pretty good, especially in comparison to other weapons I've reviewed in the past like the Trumna. This makes it one of the best weapons to build crit on. And it's not like you're losing too much in the status department either, because the status chance at base is 18%, which is pretty much average. It's not the highest, but it's also not the lowest in the world. You can definitely get better status chance with weapons like the Mutal Ceranos I've reviewed in the past, But for a weapon like this that is a single target burst rifle with high crit, having 18% status means that you're going to be able to get a status proc on most of your bursts pretty much all the time. And the primary fire is split between 24 puncture damage and 42 magnetic damage, which it previously, before the Jade Shadows update, would have been not so much a death sentence for this weapon, but would have hampered this weapon significantly. Because before the update, magnetic was just seen as viral but for shields, and because Toxin was so strong back then, you could just not even use magnetic and be perfectly fine. But now with the new magnetic working on overguard units, as well as the additional effect of proccing electric proc whenever you break the shields or overguard, this actually makes it one of the best qualities about this weapon, because you could use it as an absolute porpoise killing machine as well as an Eximus killing machine too. And combined with some of the damage types that you'll see later in this video, it makes it, in my opinion, one of the best things about this weapon. And like I said, after you get at minimum 1 kill or 3 kills to maximize its damage, we come to the alt fire of this weapon, which supports 208 radiation damage at base with a 34% crit chance and 3x crit multiplier, which makes it a really good alt fire in this sense, because you're able to get very high crit chance. But we come to the elephant in the room, and that is radiation damage. You see, as I mentioned before, radiation damage was hit the hardest because what made radiation damage so good before was the damage bonuses through armor that we had in the previous update, but now those are gone. It makes it so that it can't get bonus damage if you partially strip armor anymore. It means that radiation is really only viable against enemies like the Kuba Grunier as well as the Murmur, and even then the bonuses are not very high to incentivize using it. So the alt fire, unfortunately, just isn't that great. It's not the worst in the world, but you generally just don't want radiation damage right now. And this idea of not wanting to use the alt fire is further incentivized by the fact that it has a base status chance of 8%, meaning that you're meant to use the alt fire kind of as a tank buster type ability or weapon attack, which means that with the amount of enemies that are resistant to it or neutral to it, with very few that are actually weak to it, it means that it can't really be the tank buster blast that it's meant to be. Now, this can be fixed if you use what I said before, the augment mod Sentient Barrage for the weapon, which removes the AoE part of the weapon and gives it infinite punch through to the beam. But as I said before, it only becomes viable if you use hardened munitions, and even then, with the changes to health types and stuff, Slash has kind of been hit significantly by these changes too. So, unless you're specifically trying to maximize the alt fire, you're better off just not trying to use it that much, and instead just using the primary fire, which is just significantly better by comparison. Now, when it comes to additional mechanics to mod for on the Battacor, my personal suggestion would be to mod for punch through. You see, as I showed before in my punch through guide a while back, punch through can be used to increase the number of enemies that can be hit by a single blast of a weapon. So for example, if you have a bunch of enemies bundled up, you could shoot with one blast to hit up to, say, 3, maybe even 4, depending on the amount of punch through you have on the weapon. This is also the case with the Battacor, because since it's a burst rifle type weapon, it means that you can get up to additional 6 to 9 hits, depending on the amount of punch through that you have. So, in this case, punch through is going to be your best friend when modding for the Battacor. In addition, it's good to mod for fire rate, as I mentioned before, but most importantly, you want to use the mod Galvanized Aptitude. You see, unsurprisingly, this weapon has multiplicative gun CO, but it's not just the typical gun CO where it's only multiplicative by a certain percentage, like say 50% or even 60%. It is multiplicative at a 100% rating, which means that it will multiply all your damage significantly depending on the amount of status effects you have on the enemy. And because the base status chance of the primary fire is decently high, it means that you're going to be able to get the multiplicative CO very, very often. And if you were to combine this with, say, a primer as your secondary, or using your companion, such as the Dorega, which you see in this footage here, where it's priming the enemies with cold and other status effects, the damage can get pretty crazy with this thing. Now, because it's a single target weapon, it is best to use AoE damage types with this weapon. So, damage types like heat are kind of a no-go on this thing, especially because with the new health type changes. Heat, I wouldn't say it's fallen off, but it's not as good as it used to be, at least on single target weapons. AoE weapons, it's still worth using, just not here. So, we have to come to the conclusion of which of these is the best. Should we go electric, gas, or the new blast? Now, as you can see in this footage, I am mostly using the new blast, and there's a reason why. But let me talk about first why electric and gas are not the best. You see, the problem with electricity is that it works best on really, really high fire rate weapons that can constantly stack up those electricity procs to maximize the proc damage. And because the Battacor, even though it has a decent fire rate, it's not the fastest to keep up those electricity procs, it makes it a not so viable damage type to use on this weapon. That's not to say you can't use it, you absolutely can. It's just that you would have to mod for things like status chance, fire rate, and remove stuff like crits if you decide to mod for it. And gas also is unfortunately a no-go because although the new gas is much better than it used to be, with the fact that it only gets damage bonuses from additive damage bonuses, multiplicative bonuses, as well as crits, it makes it so that on paper the Battacor is the best one to use, but it also has to contend with other factors such as armor, the rage of the enemies, as well as the simple fact that it can only be maximized at 10 procs. And in comparison to what the new blast can do, gas just isn't a good choice on this weapon, despite it technically being the perfect weapon for it, because even in this footage that you see here, which is using a Riven, mind you, the damage of the gas procs only maximizes at around 15 to 20k, which sounds good until you see what the new blast can do by comparison. So for this reason, unless you want to use it for joke purposes, I would not recommend using gas on this weapon. And even with the new cold, it does make it good at directly killing the enemies, but in terms of maximizing the cloud damage, it is just very lackluster in comparison to what some other weapons like the Incarnate Miter can do. And now we come to the new blast, which I would argue is not just the best damage type to use on this thing, but based on what I said in my video before about the Jade Shadows update review as a whole, I think I kind of underestimated Blast a little bit, despite me praising it so much in that video. Now, based on what I said in the Jade Shadows update video, the thing about Blast that makes it so good on this thing isn't even so much the stacks itself, but it's actually the on-kill mechanic that Blast proc has. You see, in the video, as I mentioned before, for every stack of Blast that you have on the weapon, the Blast Explosion will deal 30% of the weapon's base damage to enemies in the area, dealing a much larger explosion equal to the combined amount of stacks if you get 10 stacks, or more importantly, on kill. But the thing is, the on kill explosion will do the effects of a 10 stack regardless of how many stacks you had on the target before. Meaning that with the Battacor, if you just get one single proc on the enemy and then kill them with that weapon, you are set. You're able to kill enemies extremely fast with this weapon. Now, as I mentioned before, because it scales off of the base damage of the weapon, aka additive damage buffs, it means that you can't just rely on the galvanized aptitude to get kills with this thing with the blast, because aptitude is a multiplicative bonus. So this is where it is important to use an arcane. In this case, I'm mostly using Deadhead on these builds, although you could go for something like Merciless, depending on what kind of weapon you're using. But I'm also going to be using Rift Torrent with Limbo in order to get the additive damage that we need to make the blast procs do crazy amounts of damage to different enemies. Now, in the footage that you're going to see up next, I am testing it between multiple different factions, but it is important to note that if you're going up against the Murmur specifically, it might actually be better to use electricity rather than blast, simply because the Murmur are weaker to it. But otherwise, you're going to want to use blast for pretty much every faction that you're fighting. But anyway, let the gameplay speak for itself. I would say with the Battacor's performance, it's an overall pretty good weapon, especially after the most recent update. But you might have noticed something. Sai, why didn't you show any of the builds? Well, that's where we come to the second part of this video that I wanted to talk about before fully reviewing this weapon. And that is the state of build guides slash YouTube in general when it comes to Warframe content. You see, the reason why I don't want to show builds in this video, and this is actually going to be a thing going forward for most videos, is because I want to instead explain how different mechanics work, at least in a general sense, and show you the results I'm getting, as well as maybe some of the stats on the stat screen, but not the mods themselves. I want to get people to start thinking about how I got to these results and figure it out on their own. Because the problem with most Warframe content these days is that most people will just skip to the builds and not even bother with hearing what else someone has to say about a certain weapon or different mechanics, when it's not so much the mods themselves that are important for some of these builds, but it's actually the mechanics of the weapon in general that make it important. For example, the damage that I'm doing here, you probably wouldn't be able to get if you didn't know that you needed Galvanized Aptitude to make it work, but now you do. And I want you to take this knowledge that I am giving you and apply it to this weapon, or just weapons in general, and see if you can get similar results to me, or even better results than what I'm getting. I don't want to perpetuate this whole idea of just share mods and that's it. I want you, the viewer, to actually figure this out on your own, and hopefully you will start to understand the game better. But with the mechanics I have shown you in mind, as well as how different damage types work, I would say Battacor as a whole, very solid rifle. A little expensive to get a hold of, obviously, and a little tedious to get a hold of, most importantly. But if you do decide to build into this weapon like I have, I think you're going to have a splendid time, especially with the new blast and how it interacts with this weapon. And you will never have to worry about it being too weak so long as you use Galvanized Aptitude, because Galvanized Aptitude is just ridiculous on most weapons that are multiplicative. But anyway, that's been me, Sci-Fi, showing you the pretty awesome Battacor, I would say. And I hope you guys can get to the results that I have gotten and can learn to have fun with this weapon if you decide to go for it. But anyway, that's been me. I'll see you guys all later. Have a wonderful day.